Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Broken Sword Circle of Blood, also known as Shadow of the Templars for PC, PlayStation, and Game Boy Advance. This is the first game in the Broken Sword franchise, and it was developed by Revolution Software. They're the same guys behind Beneath the Steel Sky, so if you played that and you enjoyed it, you might be eagerly looking at this, I guess. Anyway, if you're curious about the title, Circle of Blood is the North American title, and Shadow of the Templars is for everywhere else, so you usually see it referred to as Shadow of the Templars and not Circle of Blood. In fact, I never even heard of Circle of Blood until I looked this up. So, if you're curious about that, don't worry, I was too. I've just never seen it as Circle of Blood. Nobody really refers to it as Circle of Blood. They always just say Shadow of the Templars. Anyway, it was released in November of 1996 for PC, and then it was ported to PlayStation the following month, and eventually in 2002 they ported it to Game Boy Advance. Now these are all for the original version of the game, and eventually they came out with a Director's Cut version, which was released on Nintendo Wii, Nintendo DS, the iPad, iPod kind of devices, as well as the PC and Mac. So if you've played it and you've played the original game, you notice there's a lot of differences. For instance, they upgraded the art. Well, upgraded is a loose term here, but they've updated some of the art. They've threw in a couple of extra scenes that weren't in the original game, and to be perfectly honest with you, don't really feel like they're a proper part of the game. They just feel like they've been shoved in there for no reason. They also made the game easier. And I think that was mostly because of the whole Nintendo DS, Nintendo Wii thing. They were trying to appeal to the casual audience. And the original game really wasn't a casual game. Because, like most games of the time, it was pretty much accepted that if you played these kind of games, you'd been playing them for a while. So it kind of shows when you go from the original game to the Director's Cut version, a lot of the differences and how a lot of people consider the original version superior. Now, for 1996, the visuals are actually extremely good. The sprite work is extremely well done. The animations are really nice and fluid. They actually look pretty real, even for like a cartoony style. And that's a whole thing, too. They actually have cartoon animation cutscenes, and they really help to draw you into this game. It's actually really well done in the visuals department. And likewise in the sound design. Most of it is really well done. The music's kind of nice. There's a few things here and there that aren't that great, but overall it's pretty nice. The voice acting in general is decent, I should say. It's not great, it's not bad, it's decent. Some characters are really well done. George is actually very well voiced for the time, because a lot of people didn't really take voice acting seriously back then. But the French accents are god-awful, and the Irish accents are even worse. So, and I think that might just be a byproduct of it being a British game and having a fairly low budget. So, it may have just been that, and they did keep that in the Director's Cut version, by the way. So if you've been watching my Let's Play of the Director's Cut, you know how awful the voice acting can be. And at the same time, it can be very good. But the thing is, it's kind of like that cheesiness that helps draw you in, at least for the characters, because a lot of the characters are pretty lovable in the original game just because they're so absurd. Like George is such a dweeb, you can't really help but like him. And that sort of thing kind of grows on you throughout the whole game. Now, that said, there are a few characters that are just simply annoying in terms of voice acting, but overall, it's done to a point where if it's really bad, you can at least chuckle at it, and if it's not so bad, then it helps draw you into the game. Now, the story revolves around the character of George Stobart, who is an American lawyer vacationing in Paris. And he's just minding his own business one day in a Parisian cafe, when all of a sudden the cafe blows up. And he gets drawn into this conspiracy where involving like a costumed killer and that sort of thing. And so he ends up going around trying to investigate this conspiracy, and it ends up being much bigger than he thought it was, obviously. Because, I mean, there's only so much you can do with a conspiracy story. It's not a bad story by any means, nor is it a particularly great story. But it does its job very well, and it just holds the game together. Now, this game is very dialogue-driven, as opposed to a lot of other adventure games which are just narrative-driven, inner monologue kind of thing. Now, George does actually do a lot of inner monologue, but he does a lot of dialogue as well. And some of this is very well written, to the point where you're sitting there like, okay, either this is believable, or it's just silly enough that I like it. And I couldn't help but really like a lot of the dialogue, because it's kind of absurd, it's kind of silly. But it's not done in such a way where it's too absurd, it's too silly, it's not remotely believable. George just has this very positive outlook about things, and he just goes around being really he's a dweeb. I mean, you can't really say much other than that. He's kind of a dweeb, and that makes the character himself pretty lovable. But anyway, basically, the gameplay is pretty much what you expect from a point-and-click adventure game. You go around, you look for items, you pick up said items and put them in your vastly huge pockets of doom. And then you go take these objects to different things where you solve puzzles, often with these objects, or you just hand somebody the object, and that sort of thing. It's a fairly typical point-and-click adventure game. Some of the puzzles are really clever, some of them aren't so clever, but none of them are particularly difficult. Even in the original game, where it didn't really help you out that much, the puzzles aren't particularly tough. In Director's Cut, they're almost too easy because the game really helps you out a lot. But in the original game, they're really not that difficult. So you'll never feel overwhelmed by the puzzles. You might find a few of them tedious, but you'll never be overwhelmed by them. And some of them are just very clever, and you're like, aha! And you have a nice little moment when you solve them. But most of them aren't particularly difficult. So it's a pretty decent adventure game for beginners, actually. It's got a pretty solid story. It's got fairly memorable characters, at least for the main characters anyway. And overall, it's just a fun game. So I do recommend it to adventure game fans. I'd also recommend it to fans of Beneath the Steel Sky. It's not quite as good, because Beneath the Steel Sky is almost a masterpiece, really. At least in the genre. Because, I mean, it's just that well written and everything. So Broken Sword, Shadow of the Templars, also known as Circle of Blood, is definitely well worth picking up. You can actually get it on GOG bundled with the director's cut of the game, and I'll put a link in the video description box for that. And that's actually the only place you can get director's cut and the original game bundled together. Now granted, you have to download each of them separately, but still. I'll put a link in the video description box, and if you're interested, check it out. So if you're looking to get into this genre, or if you're an adventure game fan, or if you're a Beneath the Steel Sky fan, you'll probably enjoy it, so might want to take a look at it.